Welcome everyone to this second event of our mini-cycle on Russia's war against Ukraine. My name is Eleonora Tafuro Ambrosetti. I'm a research fellow with the Russia, Caucasus and Central Asia Center here at ISPI. As the title reads very clearly, we are going to focus today on the energy and environmental implications of the war, but of course we can't help but start discussing the latest developments on the ground, especially because of the latest incidents. On Saturday, there was a big blast on the bridge linking Russia with Crimea, the annexed Crimean Peninsula. The explosion partially destroyed one very important infrastructure, and the Kremlin decided to retaliate with heavy bombardments on several Ukrainian cities, including the capital city, Kyiv, killing at least 11 people. We're going to discuss all of these important topics with four guests. I'm going to introduce them to you. Joe Glauber is Senior Research Fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute and Interim Secretary of the Agricultural Market Information System. Also a VISD scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Glauber has a very broad experience also with the US Department of Agriculture, included as chief economist, and is also an expert on energy and regulatory issues. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks very much.
We have Marco Siddi as well, a Senior Research Fellow in the European Union program at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. He's also a Montalcini Assistant Professor at Cagliari University and teaches at Helsinki and Tampere universities. His focus is primarily EU-Russia relations, especially when it comes to energy and EU energy policy. Previously, Marco was also in Germany, and we're going to discuss about developments in Germany as well as a Marie Curie and Dodd Fellow. Welcome, Marco. Angelina Davydova, an expert on international and Russian climate and environmental policies. She's a civil society movements expert and also a journalist. She's now a fellow with the MICT, Media in Cooperation and Transition in Berlin, and she's been an observer with the UN climate negotiations since 2008. Welcome, Angelina.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Last but not least, we have our Associate Research Fellow, Kateryna Pishchikova, a researcher here at ISPI and also an Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the eCAMPUS University. She was a visiting scholar at the Cornell University in New York, as well as in other US institutions, such as the Kennan Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you, Kateryna, for being here.
Thank you, Eleonora.
So I'll start with you because, of course, as I remarked earlier, we should start with discussing what's going on in Ukraine, like what has been going on in the past few days. Macron has called the latest Russian strikes on Ukrainian cities a profound change in the war. At the same time, other people highlight that actually targeting civilians has become Russia's trademark, so there's nothing really new here. What do you think? Is this a turning point in the war?
Yes, I would say it is, not because of the gravity or because of the nature of attacks, but I think it really represents a different nature of military action. So if I were to organize the timeline, let's say, of the Russian invasion, we're probably in phase 3 now. Phase one being the initial phase, the so-called failed blitzkrieg phase, when Russia moved into Ukraine, setting pretty ambitious political objectives of regime change and sort of eventually also of extracting compromises from the West that would have to face this kind of new situation in Ukraine. Having failed to achieve that, we all know that by end of March, Russia had to sort of abandon those initial objectives, and we sort of seemed to have settled in a kind of phase two of the war of attrition, whereby Russian military gains were not great. It was it lost territory to the north of Kiev. It was not progressing any further on other fronts. Ukrainians were resisting pretty well, but again, were not really capable of doing much more. And so there was a sort of a stalemate situation on the front line, and again, very brutal, of course, because at that point also Russia was not really sparing, as you have mentioned, was no longer sparing civilian or other types of infrastructure, because it kind of gave up on the idea of actually making use of it itself. And so it was really more about kind of battering Ukraine into submission and sort of spreading terror. So I would argue that this second phase is pretty much over with the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which started at the end of August, beginning of September, which was pretty unexpected by everyone, I think. The observers, Russia itself, didn't expect such an effective counteroffensive. As a reminder, the counteroffensive took place on two fronts simultaneously, both in the province of Kharkiv, which is in the northeast of the country, and in the south, in the province of Kherson. The Kharkiv offensive was particularly successful, as now we have almost all of the province has been liberated. And so that the speed of this counteroffensive and the success of this counteroffensive has certainly risen the stakes in the war, and it kind of turned the tables, because it was Ukraine now that was inflicting serious damage on the battlefield, which was obviously damaging to Russia's morale, was also damaging to the kind of domestic politics of managing the war, tensions within the military, between the military and the political leadership, and so on. And it inevitably provoked Russia into looking for ways to retaliate, because it couldn't just sit there and swallow these kinds of defeats on the battlefront. And this is basically what we are unfortunately witnessing now. So the fact that we moved out of a stalemate situation on the front line means that there is a much higher risk for escalation. It's basically inevitable, but it's also unpredictable, which is, I would argue, maybe a good thing, because it means we may still hope for a kind of a less dramatic retaliation, but it certainly is likely to continue, which is of course the bad news. One point here, which I would like to address upfront, is the question of the nuclear threat, which I think is exactly what everyone is thinking about when they say Russia escalating in the war. And I think it's telling that Russia actually, the Kremlin specifically, hasn't actually mentioned this threat in the past days, which maybe, we don't know, of course, because the kind of exchanges that are going on sort of in the background are not made public. But what we do know is that President Biden has made very clear that the U.S. is going to respond in very strong, with very strong military means if something like a tactical nuclear attack were tried on by Russia. And so probably this U.S. signaling of how harsh the U.S. response would be in that case has worked. And it probably also means that there isn't really that much certainty within the Russian leadership that such an order would actually be carried out by the military, right? Because you don't want to test your own internal cohesion by ordering something as suicidal as a nuclear attack, right? Because it's not just pressing the button, right? There's a line of command which is a bit more sophisticated than that. So I think this is, for now, seems to be the only good news, really. But as you mentioned, the dramatic news is that it seems that Russia has resorted to other forms of retaliation, which one has to do with hitting civilian infrastructure, with the double goal of sort of hitting the morale of Ukrainians, but also, unfortunately, boosting the morale in Russia as well, which is a very painful evidence to watch. But it seems to me that there's more evidence coming from Russia for what it's worth, because we don't really have like good polling data or anything. But it seems that there's quite considerable support within Russia for retaliating against sort of humiliation on the battlefront. This is, I think, unlikely to bring the desired results in Russia or in the West, because actually we have seen so far that the pattern has been more brutal attacks against civilians mean actually more rally around the flag in Ukraine, and actually more rally behind Ukraine in the West as well, because it's very difficult to argue against supporting Ukraine when you are faced with such brutality. Another element that I will just mention very briefly as an opening statement is that we can see that Russia is back to kind of blackmailing with other kinds of threats, which are harder to if they were to be carried out, they would be harder to justify a more blunt retaliatory attack by the West. And these are the kind of environmental threats, for example. So blackmailing about nuclear safety of nuclear sites, nuclear plants in Ukraine, or other kinds of environmental disasters, for example. So I think this is something that is as kind of a non-military threat, but still a very likely one. And it seems that Russia is back to sort of blackmailing on that front as well. And I will stop here. So I think it's kind of pretty gloomy scenario, but also I think we should be aware of the fact that we are indeed in a new phase of this war, and we have to be prepared for that.
Thank you very much. We're going to discuss the nuclear threat certainly later on. I found particularly interesting your remarks on the support for retaliation in Russia. You're right, we don't have scientific, let's say, evidence yet, but the remarks by people like Kadyrov of Medvedev that, you know, were calling for a very strong response to the Kerch Bridge explosion are certainly very painful to hear. Marco, President Putin called the attack on Kerch Bridge an act of terrorism, and we witnessed just some days ago another act of sabotage, the blast that hit Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, the gas pipelines running from Russia to Germany under the Baltic Sea. And I think the attack, the sabotage, as they call it, showed two things. First, that Germany's infrastructure is quite vulnerable. These days, German media are also discussing about a possible sabotage hitting railways in northern Germany, and some of them are calling for more investigations on state actors that could be behind the sabotage, and also the fact that security and environment are heavily linked. So I wanted you to discuss on the latest updates on this blast hitting Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, especially with regard to EU-Russia energy relations. Do you think the attack means that this relationship is definitely over?
Right. Well, first of all, let me say that not just German infrastructure, all infrastructure is vulnerable in this context, and not just energy infrastructure. But of course, the most immediate example is the Nord Stream pipelines. What can we say about this? Before the war, there was an expectation, even fear, that by some, that this corridor would allow Germany to decouple its energy trade with Russia, with gas trades, between the rest of the EU and Russia. Now, clearly, this has not happened. And right now, there is an investigation that has just been launched by Germany, Sweden, and Denmark to try to figure out what happened. Because right now, we still don't know. We can only speculate on what has happened. Of course, I also don't know. There's two main discourses about the accident. One that is coming mostly from the West, which is Russia did it. And of course, Russia is denying this. Now, the logic, if we try to find a plausible logic to this, would be that the destruction of Nord Stream would provide Russia with force majeure to interrupt supplies. So it would not expose Gazprom to legal claims for interrupting supplies via Nord Stream. The question is, however, why Nord Stream 2 as well? Because there was no contracted gas via Nord Stream 2. The other main discourse, which comes more from Russia, but not only Russia, to be entirely honest, is that the West, and specifically the US, did it. Now, the tricky part of this explanation is that no gas was flowing before, so it wasn't necessary really for the US to do this, unless it was done in a longer-term perspective to prevent the quick resumption of such flows. But these are all speculations. So the main lesson for now is that this infrastructure is vulnerable, and of course that there was substantial environmental damage taking place in a sea that is already riddled with problems, with environmental problems from previous conflicts, from massive dumping of fertilizers. This is maybe somewhat underestimated, but it's a serious legacy of this conflict on the Baltic Sea.
And there are actually experts' calculations on the environmental damage caused by the Nord Stream blast, and some media reports I read talk about the impact being equivalent to the annual emissions from over 5 million cars. But I've read even more dramatic reports. So of course this is a dimension of this problem that is often not discussed enough, but it's absolutely important. And I want to turn to Angelina to discuss precisely these environmental implications of the war, because not just the results of the Nord Stream blast, but in general, the ecologic damage inflicted by the war is not something that is really discussed widely in the media and in policy circles, and yet it's so important. At the same time, the international attention that was focusing on climate change before the invasion has now shifted and is not discussing this important topic anymore. So I wanted to ask you about this. Can we already quantify the ecological damage inflicted by the war? Is it something that is done beyond repair, or there are still any measures that we can implement to protect the environment even when the war goes on?
Thank you for this question, and I would actually like to build on Marta's previous comments about also the environmental and the climate impact of the explosions on Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. It is indeed that in this case we can speak about direct environmental damage, meaning gas coming out into the water and potentially influencing biodiversity, wildlife, from plankton to marine mammals. The estimations of that damage still has not been done, and it will be done much later. We'll That's the usual way with marine catastrophes. Like whenever there's an environmental disaster happening at sea, we'll only be able to estimate the direct impact. And in many cases, it's connected with the wildlife that actually dies as a result. But once again, marine biologists are actually studying the immediate effects at the moment. And then we also have, as you mentioned, Eleonora, the more indirect impact, and that is the impact on the global climate in the form of greenhouse gas emissions. And you rightly said there were a number of estimations. I've also seen the estimations that the amount of gas which left the pipelines equals annual emissions of a country like Denmark. So in any case, we're speaking about large quantities. And likewise, with both direct and indirect environmental and climate impact of the war, we can, on one hand, speaking about very immediate direct impact of the war. And those are wildlife destruction, land pollution, water pollution, destruction of urban infrastructure, including water infrastructure, wildfires, all of this happening on the Ukrainian territory at the moment. Likewise, chemical pollution with weapons, chemical pollution with from various kind of military activities, chemical pollutions resulting from destructions of building, destructions of urban infrastructure, and as I mentioned earlier, also like water infrastructure, electricity infrastructure. All of this is there now. All of this is being analyzed by Ukrainian and international environmentalists. There are actually a number of international groups who regularly monitor environmental impact of the war. One of these groups is working under the auspices of the UN, the United Nations Environmental Programme. And I'm also a member of a joint Ukrainian-Belarusian-Russian group, which unites environmentalists and environmental journalists from all of these countries, and regularly publish updates about what's happening. Likewise, so we can speak about direct impact, but we can also speak about indirect impact. And indirect impact would be the amount of emissions, of greenhouse emissions. We cannot fully evaluate the overall impact of the war because the war is still going and military action is still going. And but the overall climate impact would also be, as I often say, indirect in terms of the energy market is changing. The global energy market is reshaping. Also, there's a lot of question about how climate agenda in general will proceed, like what kind of changes we see within climate policies of many countries worldwide. Say the next UN climate conference, which is taking place in a month in Egypt in Sharm el-Sheikh. Most important questions for that climate summit would be climate finance and climate adaptation and climate risks, also for developing countries. And we already see how climate finance is shrinking because so much money is being redistributed elsewhere. So you see there are a number of consequences, both direct and indirect ones, and I believe other co-panelists will also be speaking about influence of the war on food security and food deliveries. But if we take all of these factors into consideration, it's quite clear that the consequences will be massive, both on the local level in Ukraine, but also on the global level in terms of greenhouse emission reductions, in terms of climate finance, also in terms of energy decisions, which the countries are doing. I mean, in an ideal world, we will probably see more countries turning towards renewable energy now. However, what we see now in practical terms is more countries showing what I usually call a hamster behavior, and that is trying to buy as much natural gas, oil, and coal now and fill in their storage for the short term. And then still thinking and still talking about investment in renewable energy and energy transition, but later in future. So far we see new routes and new LNG terminals being built in many, for example, European countries, new gas contracts being made with the Middle Eastern countries and other countries of the world. So short-term climate agenda might be a bit less relevant for a while, long-term nonetheless, because it's obviously a global crisis. We have to do something about it, but it's also a trend which will not go away completely. But now in the short term, we'll probably see short-term increase in consumption of also on coal, for example, also in many parts of the world.
Thank you, Angelina. You mentioned food security, so I would like to turn to Joe to ask him for an assessment of the effectiveness of the grain deal brokered by the UN and Turkey. How effective it is so far, and what is the likelihood of the deal, of the renewal of the deal? I think this week Putin and Erdogan will meet in Astana. So do you think the grain deal will also be on the agenda?
Yeah, no, these are great questions. And of course, one of the main impacts of the war, at least on food security, was the fact that even prior, just the week prior to the war, the grain stopped flowing out of the Black Sea ports. Ukraine, of course, supplies 10% of the world's wheat exports. Russia, too, is a very large wheat exporter, contributing almost 24%. So particularly in February and March, very little grain coming out of the Black Sea in general, either from Ukraine or Russia. The Russian exports have pretty much, for what we can assess, looks like they're coming back to about normal levels. They've had a very large crop. Unfortunately, Russia is no longer reporting data to the UN, so we've had to try to do an assessment looking at import data reported by the major reporting importers. But Ukraine has been just, the grain was essentially bottled up within the country, and so you couldn't ship, first of all, crops that were harvested last year. When the wheat crop came on this year, it was very difficult to move that. A little bit was going overland through Romania, down the river, out through the southern ports in Romania. Some was going up through Poland or the Baltic countries, but it was just a small portion of what is normally shipped. So the Black Sea Initiative, which was announced in early August, actually, has allowed about 50% of the port capacity, or trade from about 50% of the port capacity to continue. It started as a trickle. It's actually, we've had roughly 2 million tons of wheat exported since August, 3 million tons of maize, another almost 500,000 tons of barley. So all that's very encouraging, but you have to remember that that's about half the volume that normally is shipped during this time. And so we are coming on some very traditionally heavy months for exports out of those Black Sea ports, and with a grain deal that is very, very tenuous. It expires November 15th. Putin has made several comments over the last couple of weeks of saying, this isn't what I thought I had signed on to. A lot of this grain is going to other countries, not just poor countries, and has generally cast doubt on the long-term viability of this deal. But we'll see. Turkey actually has been a very strong proponent of the deal, and hopefully, it will continue. But it just says, the deal was announced, and I think everyone remembers within a couple of hours of that deal being announced, a rocket hit Odessa ports. And so it just points to the tenuous aspects of this. And so, this is very key. It's, again, an important grain exporting region. I think markets have been remarkably resilient in the sense that importing countries like Egypt and others have found alternative suppliers, but at quite a price. And I think that's the main concern if we look at food security concerns around the world, at least on the grain side, is that prices are so high. And even though they've come down a lot, they still are running 50% higher than they were, say, 18 months ago. So that's still very much a concern. And then on top of that, the sanctions and the impact on fertilizer exports out of Russia and Belarus. Both those countries are major exporters of fertilizer, particularly potash. And at least our analysis of of exports since the war began suggests that Russia and Belarus are far, far below what they normally would be exporting. And some of that's due, The Belarus thing, of course, predates Russia, is really due to the Ryanair issue last year. Those sanctions went into place. They haven't been able to export much out of the Baltic ports of the EU. And so all of that has some impact, and potentially longer term impact, of course, because these are major fertilizer suppliers to the rest of the world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and other regions. And so the impacts on productivity and those sorts of things are very much on people's mind.
Thank you. Food security, nuclear threats, ecologic damage caused by sabotage and blasts. Kateryna, it really seems that security and environment are highly related. How can we conceptualize this link? And especially, do you think Russia is using also environmental damage as a weapon?
I'm not sure this really has to do with the conscious use of environmental damage as a weapon. So I think it's a kind of a strategy of convenience, not necessarily a sort of well-premeditated strategy. And it's interesting, for example, that pretty early on in the war, some international experts were talking about environmental war crimes, and discussing, the legal basis for actually prosecuting Russia eventually for that. And there's literature on that showing how the scale and the irreplacement and irreparability of some of the biosphere or other kind of resources, environmental resources, actually points to the possibility to call these environmental war crimes and kind of move this into the discussion about premeditated damage, just as happens with military attacks on other kinds of on infrastructure, for example. So there's certainly this question of how far we can go in saying this is actually used as the environmental risk is actually being weaponized. This has certainly been the case with the nuclear plants in Ukraine. So Ukraine has something about 15 active nuclear reactors, and I think throughout these months, Russia has been pretty open about in its threats that something might happen there. But then again, obviously from the Russian perspective, they are not hitting them deliberately themselves. They're just saying, putting the blame on the Ukrainians and saying it's the military action itself that endangers those sides. But we are not the ones to blame, as if they were not the ones who invaded the area in the first place. So there's certainly a link there. We also, I think what is interesting in all the comments that we have heard so far is that it shows how these risks are really the kinds of risks that travel beyond borders. So we are actually on the same continent, and we do actually share a lot of that ecosystem. We share the water because of the seas and the rivers. We share the air, obviously. So I think again, the assessment of environmental damage that will eventually be made public as the data is being gathered will certainly make it evident how this is actually affects our environmental safety in Western Europe as well. And so I think again, when we talk about the pollution, that all the things that Angela has mentioned very clearly. There's also risk, of course, in case of a sort of a massive environmental disaster. There's obviously risk of further displacement of people because of the risk to their lives. So that is something we have seen in other conflicts as well. That it's not just the conflict itself, but the kind of environmental risks that it creates that pushes the people to move, and that again is a big problem. So I think really environment is key to security, and it's key to security in the longer term as well. Again, just to stress the point made by previous speakers, that the fact that we are not focusing on combating climate change has a cost in itself. It's a longer term cost for everyone, and especially for the European Union that has put such high stakes in the Green Deal and in the green transition. And we obviously see how the priorities are being redirected, and this debate about whether the urgency of the situation is an opportunity for us to actually invest and quicker than we were planning to into the energy transition, or whether it actually sets us back because we are going to just replace the sources of sort of traditional sources for traditional energy types, and so that would actually distract us from completing that transition, and we will sort of run out of money before we actually did, or in any case, we will not use those resources to implement that. So I think there's a lot in the short term, and there are a lot of immediate risks and threats, but there's also a lot to consider in the long term and sort of in strategic terms as well.
Thank you so much. And speaking of the EU, I'd like to ask Marco about the 8th package of sanctions approved by Brussels. These sanctions include also sanctions to energy, especially Russian oil. So what do these sanctions entail for the Russian energy industry, and how far have we gone with regard to the discussions on a possible price cap on gas?
Right. So the 8th package of sanctions focuses on technology. There is a stress on technologies that could be used by the Russian army in various ways. But there is also the legal basis for an oil price cap along the lines that were discussed in early September by the G7. So as you know, most G7 members, if not all of them, actually already have a ban on imports of Russian oil. For the EU, the ban is partial, but it covers seaborne Russian oil imports. So that means most of Russian oil imports. So what is what are the new sanctions about? They are especially about services to transport Russian oil to third countries. And this is because EU companies, so Western companies, have a dominant role in this sector in providing insurance and services for transportation. So it's a lot about this. It's a lot about making sure that, or ensuring that Russian oil exports to other countries do not overcome a certain price. Now, we have to see, of course, if the other countries play ball. It's easy to agree on this at G7 level, but you're not discussing it with other countries. And we have seen that there are different views, even from traditional Western allies like Saudi Arabia. Essentially, this is it. And regarding the gas price cap, well, this is another very complicated area. There are different views on what should be capped. If all gas should be capped, if only the price of gas on long-term contracts. Some member states have implemented a gas price cap for gas that is used in the power generation sector. So the discussion is still ongoing, and the Czech presidency of the European Union has proposed to have a special meeting of energy ministers in November. So it will definitely take more time to see developments, if any, in this field, because some countries are opposed. And, opposition has some rationale too, because we don't know if such a measure would eventually impact EU consumers more than the sanctioned countries. So this is also a possible scenario. It's a very complex context. I wanted to make another point also on environmental consequences, but I don't know if I have time for it.
If it's very quick, because also we've got questions coming from the audience. Let me remind everyone that you can pose your questions through our social media. But if it's a quick point, then go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think several excellent points were made, but one of the unfortunate issues of replacing Russian gas with imports from elsewhere in the form of LNG is that LNG is more environmentally impactful, especially if you transport it from over long distances. And also in countries where, for example, you have fracking as an extraction process. So this is also a big issue. And this is why the war, besides being a tragedy, is also extremely dysfunctional in terms of energy and markets and the environment.
This is a very important point, and it's not just dysfunctional in the energy and field, but also more in general. Somebody has said that the war is causing like economic deglobalization, a sort of also nationalizing economies. So definitely an important point. Angelina, another spillover of the war is that the space for civil activists in Russia has further shrinked. So my question is, how can we expect Russia to fulfill its environmental goals that it had stated before? He wanted to go climate neutral by 2060. If such an important component of the civil society groups promoting environmental issues cannot express themselves anymore?
Well, it is indeed a very important question. And as you rightly state, civil society and also environmental and climate activists probably find themselves in the most difficult situation ever in their lives. The overall political situation in Russia was already not that favorable towards activism and civil society before the war, but ever since the beginning of the full-scale war in late February, it became almost impossible to do any kind of political campaign, lobby work, or activism. So what happens is that many activists and oppositional leaders and also journalists have left the country and now residing elsewhere. What's also happening is that many environmental groups which are still out there, they still pursue the local or regional environmental campaigns, but try to refrain from they call political topics. So any connection with the war in Ukraine or direct imposition to authorities. Greenpeace and WWF are still working in Russia, but they're also trying to be somewhat very cautious about their statements, even though Greenpeace is doing a great job in trying to follow the rollback of environmental legislation, which is actually happening in Russia. There's a lot of watering down of environmental standards, for example, happening right now. There is new huge hurdles for environmental expertise, also like civil environmental expertise. There's a lot happening in the area of, for example, introduction of new requirements for polluters, including introduction of the so-called best available technologies. And then many companies have been actually pushing for further rollback of environmental legislation, saying, look, we work in such difficult conditions, we can hardly make it in these times of the sanctions and various other limitations in our experts. We just have to take care of the jobs that we have. So can we maybe not have any environmental checks or not pay any environmental payments for the next, 2-5 years? Officially, Russia says it's still on board with the Paris Agreement, with other international agreements in the area of climate and environment. And what we also see, and that's quite surprising, I've kind of been trying to follow the the domestic debate about the topic, and also speak to many experts who are still in the country, is that Russia now is trying to say we're not going away from the green agenda, but we're now trying to develop our own domestic sovereign green agenda, not the one imposed by us from the West, but the one which we develop ourselves, the one which we think is relevant for Russia. And likewise, Russia is now trying to establish further contacts also in the area of climate and sustainable development with other actors and other countries which are not considered to be enemy countries. And those are mainly the BRICS countries. Russia is very much looking to China and India, not only in terms of selling more oil or wood products to those countries, but also trying to develop further like soft policy mechanisms of cooperation. But this is like one level. What's happening on a practical level, as I already mentioned, a lot of rolling back of environmental agenda, but also some, for example, the legislation on vehicle standards has been rolled back to what we had 20 years ago. And now vehicles of a standard as low as Euro 0 can be produced in Russia. Likewise, at the moment, there's an abundance of oil and oil products in Russia, which have not been sold elsewhere. So oil companies have been pushing for more heavy oil to be used for energy generation, for heating, instead of natural gas. Another example is gas flaring, and many oil companies, once again, pushing the government to allow them to actually burn flaring gas. Now, that was quite a big topic in Russia many years ago. And then throughout the last, say, 10 years, there were a number of international programs also supported by the World Bank, which made huge investments and it helped with some climate-related, like green finance for oil companies to actually capture the flaring gas and process it into kind of plastics, which was later exported to the European Union. Now that track is gone. And now the oil companies say, look, we don't know what to do with this flaring gas. Can we just, burn it again? Well, it's obviously not good news for local environmental situation in these regions, but also the global climate situation in this region. And likewise, as you mentioned, Russia's target for going net zero is still there, 2060. But for example, the long-term low carbon development strategy, which was adopted last year, 2021, there should be a plan of its implementation delivered this year. Well, actually, what that exactly would that mean, and what should be done by which ministries, companies, regions? Now it looks like the Ministry of Economics cannot come up with this plan this year. They'll have to see how the economy will be doing next year. So a lot of things still unclear. Officially, green agenda remains to be there, but in practical terms, we need to look beyond words and beyond political statements.
Thank you, Angelina. Joe, my last question for you is about the global food price crisis. How do you expect this important thing to evolve, considering that the war is likely to drag on?
Yeah, I think that really is one unique aspect of this current food price crisis relative to other ones that we've experienced over the last 10, 15 years. I mean, you recall we had very high prices in 2007, 2008, and then again in 2010, 11, largely because of droughts and other policies like biofuels policies and things like that caused prices to increase dramatically during that period. Essentially, in both of those cases, supply caught up with demand. I mean, we had returned to bumper crops around the world. And so roughly by 2013 or so, prices had begun to come down following a North American drought. And prices were at a fairly low, certainly relative to those peaks in 2010, 11, and 2007, 8. Prices were at a fairly low level for about 10 or 15 years until we came into the most recent period. I would expect typically, if you had asked me at the beginning of the year when agricultural prices were already quite high because of some climatic events last year, I would have said that we would expect the stocks to recover this year and with bigger crops. But with this war, it's just meant that the stock situation is still, global stocks are at the lowest levels since 2007-8 for wheat, 2012-13 for maize and soybeans. And after a year, we still don't see any improvement. And unfortunately, again, because the grain is not flowing out of Ukraine, that means that stocks have built up in the country, that prices are actually quite low relative to world market prices. And so there's strong disincentives, unfortunately, to plant crops, let alone the fact that, again, a war is going on. And with that, I think is sort of the long run issue. So to me, this extends the problems at the very least into 2023 and likely into 2024. I think that's a real potential problem because of just the fact that Ukraine is such a large supplier. Now, good crops worldwide, we could see some improvement, but right now stocks are low, and that means prices will continue to be volatile and high.
It's a pretty gloomy scenario for the short to medium term. So we've got 10 minutes left and 3 questions. One comes from Daniel, and I think it's for Marco. Why the EU still hasn't forced Norway to share the huge extra profits its energy companies have been making over all of these months? Do you think, Marco, this is quite provocative question if you want, but do you think that Norway is actually taking advantage of the situation to provide EU states with, like a quite expensive gas?
Well, obviously, everyone is doing their own interests, and we shouldn't forget that Russia is not the only oil and gas producer, and others also benefit from the current market situation. This is true of Norway, it is true of Qatar, it is true of countries that have the capacity, at least to an extent, to ramp up exports. So, and for the EU, it's difficult, to have measures that affect the remaining partners, because that they don't like them. There is disagreement. So the disagreement about, for example, gas price cap is not just about Russian gas. It's also about gas coming from somewhere else. It's about the market effects that this will have, because it could lead to a tightening of the supply and even higher prices within the EU. So it's quite tricky. And we know that, I would say, the EU doesn't have a strong tradition of being tough with energy companies. Before the war in Ukraine started, before the invasion in February 2022, we saw, for example, that gas was included in the green taxonomy. So this gives you an idea a little bit of what kind of forces affect EU decision-making in this field.
So you're claiming it was included as a result of the lobbying of gas companies?
I would say that it definitely played a role. It's difficult to reconstruct exactly, but it seems to be quite logical.
Thank you so much. Very clear. I have a question to Angelina from our colleague Maria Chiara. What is the state of international institution discussion about the disruption in climate issues and policies caused by the war, if there is such a discussion?
I'm sorry, Eleonora, I had a power breakdown here. Could you please repeat the question?
Absolutely. So the question is, do we have an international institutional discussion on the climate disruptions caused by the war? Is it a topic that has been discussed in relevant multilateral institutions?
Well, there is an ongoing discussion about that. There is, as I mentioned, there's a working group on the environmental and climate consequences of the war created by the United Nations Environmental Programme. And there are also a number of more specialized discussions originated and initiated by the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian Environmental Ministry. And likewise, there are many further specialized groups among experts who are trying to analyze what is happening, present this data, and that comes in forms of many research projects and like analysis of satellite imagery, for example, done by a number of organizations, both the ones who professionally follow environmental impact of the war, but also they're just environmental and climate experts from the area, just like the group I was mentioning I'm involved in, which is called Ukraine Environmental Consequences, Ukraine War Environmental Consequences Work Group. I believe if you are working in the area of environmental climate, you will be and you can be connected to any of these groups and also participate in their work. Now, the really big question also, as you mentioned at the very beginning, whether that discussion is really going beyond the specialized bubble and beyond the bubble of the experts. It's a bit challenging for me to estimate it because I'm truly someone within this bubble. But I also get a feeling, for example, there's more and more publications in international media about this topic, also about the immediate environmental impact and, for example, the threat of destruction of nuclear facilities or potential nuclear threat, but also more indirectly of consequences on the greenhouse gas emissions and climate actions in general.
Thank you very much. We have one last question from Ludovica. She's asking about the risks connected to the environmental refugees that are fleeing the environmental damage caused by the war. Is there, maybe Kateryna, you want to say something about environmental refugees? I mean, is it something that we can actually distinguish very clearly from regular refugees?
I think it's impossible, really, unless short of a very clear disaster, like something happens at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, and then we can see how people try to run. I mean, it's really difficult to separate the two issues. And in terms of refugees, I think we also have to probably prepare ourselves to a scenario whereby there might be a new wave of refugees, not because of environmental damage per se, but because in the case Ukrainian government is not capable of restoring civilian infrastructure efficiently enough and rapidly enough as we move into winter. So that might provoke more people to consider leaving the country. So if we look at the statistics of how the Ukrainians have moved around, let's say, since the beginning of the Russian invasion, we can see that there was a sort of a first wave of refugees or internally displaced persons who were just, pushed by the shock of the invasion. Then as the situation sort of stabilized, and especially as the area around Kiev was liberated, many people actually came back. And many surveys among Ukrainian refugees in the European countries actually indicate that a huge percentage of those who are still in Europe are very are willing and are actually planning to go back as soon as possible. So that was certainly during the second phase of the war, because they could see that the stalemate might actually then move into a more favorable situation at home. Now, if the situation escalates, as I mentioned at the beginning, and if this means that people really struggle to survive through the winter and they really see how their livelihood is really not tenable anymore just because of the lack of water and heating and electricity, that might reverse this trend of people trying to go back home and then produce sort of a new wave, or let's say increase the number of refugees. But these are all, of course, very approximate projections. I mean, these are all speculations, of course, but I think we shouldn't underestimate just the fact that the value and the importance of civilian infrastructure, especially as we're going into the winter, in terms of how people are going to try and survive this period.
Thank you very much, Kateryna, and thank you all for your insights. It's been a very interesting event. Thank you also to all our audience. They sent very good questions. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, so we must close the event. But thank you again, and I hope to see you soon in our next events.